Commission will come to order, and I apologize for the lateness in convening the hearing, and I would ask our witnesses and our audience to have some forbearance. There are a series of votes on the floor of the House that will have members coming in and out, but I want to assure our distinguished Assistant Secretary Michael Posner that all of us and those who are not here will read your testimony very carefully and are very grateful that you're here to give testimony to us today. I want to welcome all of you to our second Helsinki Commission hearing on the volatile and dangerous situation facing Coptic Christians in Egypt following the Arab Spring. And our hearing is entitled From Arab Spring to Coptic Winter, Sectarian Violence and the Struggle for Democratic Transition in Europe. The world watched with hope and anticipation, and for some of us with trepidation, as events unfolded in Tahrir Square earlier this year. This spring we saw Christians standing guard over Muslims during Friday prayers in the middle of the square. We saw Muslims standing guard over Christians as they celebrated Mass in Tahrir. Sadly, much has changed since then. While many of those who came together to forge the revolution want to continue that solidarity as they support Egypt's political transition, there are many others, far too many others, who do not. The transition period has been increasing violence against Coptic Christians. The current Egyptian government, controlled by the Supreme Alliance Council of the Armed Forces, has not adequately responded to this violence, has not protected vulnerable Coptic Christians, and as we have seen on video to our horror, has even committed acts of violence against Coptic protesters. On Sunday, October 9th, 27 people were killed and more than 300 injured in Maspero when Egyptian military attacked a peaceful group of Coptic Christians protesting the burning of a church in Aswan and demanding the removal of the governor of Aswan, who had justified the mob's destruction of the church. In this massacre at Maspero, witnesses saw the army fire on Coptic demonstrators with live ammunition and plow through the crowd with armored vehicles. Soldiers raided and stopped the live broadcast of two independent news channels that had been covering the clashes. At the same time, state-run television and radio reported that the Coptic demonstrators had attacked the military and called for honorable citizens to defend the army against attack, inciting violence against the Coptic minority. Amid widespread domestic and international outrage over the events, the White House issued a statement on October 10th saying that, quote, the president is deeply concerned about the violence in Egypt and that has led to a tragic loss of life. Now is the time for restraint on all sides so that Egyptians can move forward together to forge a strong and united Egypt. With all due respect, the president seems to have completely missed the point. This is not a situation of equal power and equal responsibility for violence. This was not a lawless gang clash on the street or a mob marauding the streets in the absence of a government. The Coptic community was protesting the fact that the Egyptian government in Aswan failed to protect Coptic property and allowed a mob to burn down the Coptic place of worship. When Copts called on the military government to treat the Copts as equal citizens and protect their rights, the government itself turned on them with a massacre. The time has come to ask, is this government going to be better than the Mubarak thug regime? This same government is investigating itself for the incident, and its assault on human rights continues. In fact, the military has arrested at least 28 people, mostly Copts, in connection with the clashes, including prominent blogger Alaa Abdel Fattah. These individuals are being hauled before military prosecutors. To date, despite multiple videos and eyewitnesses' accounts showing the military's use of lethal violence against peaceful protesters, the Egyptian military has yet to take responsibility for its actions or otherwise demonstrate that it will protect all Egyptians, including the Coptic minority that make up more than 10% of its population. According to the press reports of last week, a member of a government-backed fact-finding committee said that the Egyptian army did not use live ammunition to disperse protesters during the October 9th incident. Yet Hafez Abu Saida, a senior figure in the government-sponsored National Council for Human Rights, which set up the committee, also said that an independent investigation was needed to establish the full facts, and that some state institutions, including the Army, did not cooperate fully with the committee. Rights activists, including the Arab Network for Human Rights Information and Human Rights Watch, have criticized the report for a lack of detail. Tragically, the massacre at Maspero is not an isolated incident, but rather a continuation of the endemic discrimination against and the marginalization of Coptic Christians in Egypt. According to the 2010 State Department International Religious Freedom Report for Egypt, and I quote, "The status of respect for religious freedom by the government remained poor, unchanged from the previous year. Christians and members of the Baha'i faith, which the government does not recognize, face personal and collective discrimination, especially in government employment and their ability to build, renovate, or repair places of worship. The government failed to prosecute perpetrators of violence against the Coptic Christians, according to the State Department report, and failed again to redress laws, particularly laws relating to church construction and renovation, and government practices, especially government hiring that discriminates against Christians, especially allowing their discriminatory effects and their modeling effect on society to become further entrenched. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom has noted that, and I quote, "In response to sectarian violence, Egyptian authorities typically conduct reconciliation sessions between Muslim and Christians as a means of resolving disputes. In some cases, authorities compel victims to abandon their claims to legal remedy. The failure to prosecute perpetrators fosters a climate of impunity." Close quote. A report by the Egyptian Initiative for Human Rights, covering the period from January 2008 to January 2010, documented 53 incidents of sectarian violence, about 2 incidents per month that took place in 17 of Egypt's 29 governorates. Most of the attacks were by Muslims on Christians and Christian churches or property. Egypt will not reach, I would submit, its democratic goals through the oppression of its minority peoples. Democracy does not come with an iron fist. Rather, democracy springs from the belief that all people are created equal and have the right to participate in their own governance. A legitimate government is of the people, by the people, and for the people, including minorities. A legitimate government submits to the rule of law. The Egyptians demonstrated their belief in the Tahrir Square, but seemed to be losing their way, spinning backwards into tyrannical abuses of power. If there is any hope for a democratic and peaceful Egypt, the Copts must be allowed to contribute actively to Egyptian society and to the transformation of their country without fearing for their lives. I'd like to now introduce our very distinguished first witness, a man that I've known for many years when he used to work for the Committee for Legal Scholars, the Lawyers' Rights Committee, as well as for other human rights organizations in the past, Human Rights First. And I'll introduce them, and I understand there is another vote. It's on. And I will have to report to the floor, so we'll be in brief recess, and then Mr. Posner, Secretary Posner, will ask you to present your testimony. And I know some of the members will be back then. But so maybe on that point, I'll just, we'll be in recess for just a few minutes. Sorry about that.
The White House issued a similar statement urging Egyptians to move forward to forge a strong and united Egypt, reaffirming our belief in religious minorities. In raising our concerns, we are aware that the government of Egypt is doing some things, and I want to point them out. They have, in fact, initiated 2 investigations in response to the Maspero violence. The first is a Egyptian Armed Forces review of the conduct of the military police. As you've indicated, the military police, according to eyewitnesses and video evidence, ran over and shot at demonstrators. Separately, military prosecutors are investigating about 30 demonstrators, including one prominent blogger who were detained during the violence. They're accused of inciting violence and attacking security forces. During the height of the clashes, and this is something I want to emphasize as well, one of the state TV anchors called on honorable Egyptians to defend the army against attacks by violent demonstrators. 21 prominent Egyptian human rights organizations have criticized the official media for what they call their inflammatory role in actually provoking greater violence. The Coptic community is concerned, as we are, about the severity and frequency of these attacks, while they recognize, as we do, that these attacks are not necessarily and not the product of government provocation. They're greatly concerned, as we are, about the need to hold perpetrators accountable. I want to make clear that most of the clashes have involved both Copts and Muslims, and members of both communities have been perpetrators as well as victims. It's also important to note that many Muslims have stood up to defend members of the Coptic community against extremist violence. I want to finish with two other things that the government's now doing, which is important for us to emphasize and reinforce. One, the government has pledged to adopt a unified places of worship law, which would guarantee all faiths the ability to construct and maintain places of worship. This is a debate that's gone on for years. The cabinet sent a draft law to the military council in October. We urge strongly, and we have been in discussion with the government, the prompt adoption of this provision would send a very strong signal of the government's commitment to protect religious freedom. And finally, we welcome steps the government has taken to reduce discrimination in their penal codes. On October 15th, the SCAF issued a decree amending the penal code to prohibit discrimination on the basis of religion, gender, language, faith, or race. This provision reinforces and will give life to Article 7 of the March 31st Constitutional Declaration on the same subject. We urge the government to enforce these provisions and to make non-discrimination the order of the day. Like Egyptian Muslims, Egyptian Copts are concerned about their country's future. In addition to security from sectarian violence and equal treatment under the law, they want equal representation in Parliament, a proportional voice on the committee that will draft the new constitution. The vast majority of Egyptians support religious freedom, and we support their efforts. As Secretary Clinton said last week, and I'm quoting here, if over time the most powerful political force in Egypt remains a room full of unelected officials, they will have planted the seeds for future unrest, and Egypt will have missed a historic opportunity. Mr. Chairman, the door for real democratic change is only beginning to open in Egypt. We hope Egyptians will walk through it together towards a more peaceful and prosperous future. Thank you.
Secretary Posner, thank you very much for your testimony, and I'd like to begin with a few questions. The first would be whether or not you believe and whether or not the department believes that the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces deliberately provoked a confrontation with Coptic Christian demonstrators on October 9th. Will they be able to credibly investigate themselves regarding that incident, as they have claimed that they will? And then what steps do you believe that the government will take, proactive steps, to ensure that those kinds of events don't happen again?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We see no evidence of a deliberate provocation. What is of concern, and what I highlighted in the testimony, is one, that there be a real investigation and accountability for the actions of both the military police and security forces. That's the first and best protection against future acts of violence. There needs to be a clear demonstration that those responsible will be held accountable and that the government is fully committed to investigating these acts. The second, the piece that I talked about last, I think also helps set a climate of tolerance and of official recognition of the importance of diversity. The unified law allowing churches and mosques on the same status in all religions to build religious facilities, to repair them and the like, that's an important demonstration by the government that it is operating on the theory that all religions need to be treated the same, as well as the provisions in the penal code dealing with discrimination. So I think those two things together, strong investigation, prosecution, accountability, and affirmative steps by the government by word and deed that suggest, in fact, the new Egypt is one where there is no official discrimination and the government respects the ability of every religion to practice freely.
If I could, with regards to the investigation, has the government sought the help of ourselves or any other international law enforcement asset, whether it be the FBI, Scotland Yard, any other Arab armed forces network, to ensure that it's aggressive, credible, and comprehensive? You and I both remember that one of those, what helped in Northern Ireland tremendously was when international investigators were invited to work in a cooperative way with the RUC to ensure that acts of violence and by the paramilitaries were investigated properly. It takes I would suggest, the tinge out of whether or not it's a real investigation or not, or whether or not there's an effort to suppress evidence. Has anything like that happened? Have they reached out to us or any other country?
I'm not aware of any requests for our help. I will say one of the things we are very mindful of and sensitive to is that both in the political process and in the reform process, these are steps that need to be led and directed by the Egyptian people themselves. We stand ready, and the government knows that, to provide assistance as it's useful and necessary. I know there have been some discussions in a broader sense. I've been part of some of those discussions with the Ministry of Interior about ways in which there can be, enhanced police reform and training. We stand ready to be helpful, but we are also mindful of the importance that these reforms need to be initiated by and directed by the government of Egypt.
Is it something you think we should reach out to them purely on a technical assistance basis? I mean, some of the very advanced protocols that our law enforcement people employ certainly would ensure a more comprehensive investigation. Is it something you might take back and look and see whether or not that might be useful?
I'm glad to take that back. I had a good conversation with Ambassador Patterson on Thursday. She is adept, as good as our diplomatic corps ever produces. She knows the scene there very well now and is in constant conversation both with the government and with the SCAF. And I have every confidence that if there's a way in which we can be helpful, we will make the government aware of that. And we certainly, it's not lost on the government of Egypt how important their next actions are with regard to this attack. It's gotten a huge amount of attention both here and in Egypt, and they know well. This hearing is another example of the extent to which the accountability issue needs to be addressed.
Secretary Posner, as you know, immediately prior to the revolution, there was a huge cut in economic assistance for human rights and democracy building. And laying blame nowhere, whether it be on Congress or the administration, it was rather significant. Could you tell us how much U.S. economic assistance today is directed towards promoting human rights?
Well, as you know, Mr. Chairman, for FY10, we undertook to shift some of the economic support funds to democracy and governance, and some combination of our office, the Middle East Partnership, MEPI, and USAID are now funding a range of activities support both for strengthening democratic process, training of political parties, voter education, etc., but also work with independent labor unions, journalists on some of these issues we're discussing today. The number, I think, is in the vicinity of $50 million for FY10. And I think again, this is part of what the discussion has been internally in our government and with members of Congress. I think it's important that we now recognize, and we do, that there are a range of places we can and should be helpful in sustaining and encouraging the democratic process to go forward.
Just two final questions. How does a Coptic Christian raise a concern with the government and work to protect their own civil liberties? Who do they go to?
I think, one of the, hopefully one of the signposts for the future will be the election over the next several months of a new parliament, which will include members of a new political order who are going to be more open and responsive to the needs of all Egyptians, including the Coptic community. We are certainly encouraging Egyptians of all faiths to participate elections, which start on November 28th. And I would think that would be the best starting place for people in the Coptic community and all Egyptians to begin to use their democratic muscles and raise concerns to their own communities.
But what happens, I mean, I was one of those who was skeptical, and I wasn't alone in that, as people were getting teary-eyed over whether or not this meant real reform or a further consolidation by groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. And I would appreciate your thoughts on the Muslim Brotherhood, if you would, whether or not perhaps we may, as a government, underestimated their savviness in appearing to be more moderate, but now are consolidating power. And frankly, in terms of election muscle, I mean, minorities by definition are profoundly disadvantaged, which is why at least our country and many countries have very strong rules protecting minorities. And I know, there are places that so many of us as Democrats or Republicans, when we run for election, if we're gerrymandered into a certain area, you could provide the greatest service imaginable and still not get elected and still not potentially have your voice heard. And I think when you're about 10% of the population and there is this governmental or very profound bias against Coptic Christians, and as you mentioned, there are other ethnic or religious minorities as well, unless you have strong protections, their disadvantage becomes perhaps even persecution, which I think is what's happening now. Dina Gregaros will testify later, and when you answer that, if you could just respond to this comment, because she said, or will say, one only needs to give a cursory look at SCAF's history since its assumption of power. Over 12,000 civilians have been tried in military tribunals that do not meet minimum standards of due process. Female protesters have been subjected to degrading virginity tests. The notorious emergency law has been extended, and numerous laws restricting freedom of assembly and even criminalizing criticism of the military have been opaquely passed and enforced in draconian fashion. And then she goes on, local rights groups have already decrying these abuses and more, including SCAF's pre-election conduct, which observers accurately note portends to substantial fraud in the upcoming elections where Islamists are expected to win a substantial parliamentary presence. That paints an extremely ominous present and certainly a more ominous future. What's your take on that?
I would say, having worked in the human rights field for 30-some years, that I'm an eternal optimist, so take this comment with that in mind. I believe we are at the beginning of a transition in Egypt. Some might call it a transition to a transition. I don't think we can expect to see instantaneously the kind of a democratic foundation laid that we would all hope and expect to see over time. Secretary Clinton, in her speech last week, spoke about this, and I think the some of the elements you've raised are exactly the things we need to be pressing on. We do believe that there ought to be and needs to be a lifting of the state of emergency. We do believe that there needs to be an opening up of the process for, there to be a real lively debate where multiple parties are allowed to function freely, where there's a free press, where state television takes on a more balanced approach, where religious freedom flourishes. Those things are going to happen over time if there's a sustained push by Egyptian people supported by governments like ours to do that. We don't believe, what we want to see is that parties that are committed to rejecting violence, that abide by the rule of law, that respect freedoms of speech, religion, association, that respect the rights of women, are allowed to participate. Our view is if that happens, over time we're going to get a result that we like that's going to lead to a real democratic transition. We've got to hold our nerve. We've got to stay involved and engaged. But I think we all understand that there are a range of challenges that we face in the coming weeks and months that we need to be attentive to, and we need to be at the same time patient and resolute.
Is there concern that we might be underestimating the Muslim Brotherhood?
We are certainly, as we watch what is happening, it's clear that the Muslim Brothers are well organized as a political party and that they will compete actively and aggressively in the election. Again, the decision about who to vote for is for the people of Egypt. Our role and our goal needs to be to promote a long-term democratic transition that's based on the notion of strengthening of a political process that's going to lead to a democratic, freely elected government, a constitution that supports that, and the democratic infrastructure that yields the kind of result that we're going to be, that Egyptian people are going to feel proud of, and that's going to make them a good and stable ally.
I do have one final question, and that would be, a few months ago, Michelle Clark, who used to be number 2 at O'Dear, and you and I did have a conversation about this, as you'll recall, testified and said it's no longer a matter of allegation that young Coptic teenage girls are abducted. She said the number was in the thousands, and when they turn 18 after the kidnapping, they are given to an Islamic man, a Muslim man, who then makes her his wife. The women are often subjected to a great deal of exploitation, compounding the original kidnapping itself. And she even talked about the very awful term that this is a Islamization of the womb, Islamicizing the womb, that whatever children she bears will be Muslim, which is an absolutely outrageous human rights abuse from every way that it's looked at. The kidnapping, the trafficking, the forced conversion, and then the subsequent forced conversions of any children born to her in that so-called marriage. Have you been able to look into that as a bureau? I know the ambassador, Congressman Wolf, took the information from that hearing and had a meeting in his office and asked her to, aggressively look into it. Michelle Clark said that, we should no longer use the word allegation, that it's beyond that. She did the investigations herself. And matter of fact, she said these reports are, this is her quote, from July 22nd here in this room at a commission hearing. These reports are not allegations, nor should they be disputed. Coptic women disappear. Coptic women are forcibly converted or converted under false pretenses. And Coptic women are forcibly married to Muslim men. What is your investigation or look into this discovered?
We are, I know you raised this and we had a previous conversation about it, and I have made inquiries about the particular cases. We have, let me say broadly, we obviously are greatly concerned about the Egyptian government's failure to allow conversion of Muslims to Christianity and the various measures, coercive or discriminatory measures against those who seek to express their religious faith. The particular cases that she raised, we have not been able to substantiate the facts, although I'd be willing, or our people in our office would be willing to meet with her. But we are concerned about the broader phenomenon of the kind of coercive or discriminatory measures against people who are either trying to convert from Islam to Christianity, which the government doesn't recognize, or the kinds of coercive things that she raises. Again, the particular cases I can't speak to.
If you could, I'm sorry, Mr. Secretary. If you could, how robustly have we tried to substantiate those? Have Foreign Service officers or human rights officers gone into the field? Have they done extensive interviews to determine whether or not this is a barbaric phenomenon that's ongoing?
We have made inquiries through the embassy, and what I can do, and I will do, and I promise to do, is go back. I'd actually like to get a hold of her testimony and maybe have people in our office talk to her, and then we can look at the specific cases that she raises, and we'd be glad to look at it in more detail.
So, just to be clear, have any of our human rights investigators gone out and done first-person reporting on this?
Well, I think you and others have said this is a phenomenon, and the cases that have come to our attention, we have gone to look to see, can we verify the facts? We haven't been able to do that, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. So what I would suggest is let me take a look at the testimony that she gave to you. If there are particular cases and facts, we welcome getting them. And then I will endeavor to make sure that either people in my office or people in the embassy follow up and they get to the bottom of what's happened in those cases.
If you could, because her testimony was very, very incisive and outrageous, what she uncovered. I mean, she even went through how it's often done, the befriending of Coptic girls by Muslim girls, that it's a process, and that it just, as well as straight up, flat out abductions, and all leading to the same consequence.
Right. The thing that will be most helpful to us is if there are particular cases with facts, et cetera, that we can then pursue rather than the general pattern. Sure.
But if we could also be looking to see on our own, not just following up on one of her leads, because it would seem to me that, it's like any other kind of abuse, unless we're really aggressively looking for it, it is so easy to conceal this. And so I'd like to, before I yield to Commissioner Pitts, Fred Grandy, a former distinguished member of the House of Representatives, is here. He's Executive Vice President of the Center for Security Policy. And I want to welcome our former colleague for joining us today, and thank him for his work on Egypt. I'd like to yield to Mr. Pitts.
Does it work? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Posner, thank you for your testimony. Do you have, or could you provide, a list of the actions such as meetings with advocacy groups, public statements, conversations with Egyptian officials, activities at the UN, that this administration, including the State Department, has taken since January to support the rights of minorities in Egypt? And if this list is not available today, could you provide us a list in writing?
Sure. There are, you just mentioned 5 or 6 categories of things, and we've taken actions in all of those areas. I can certainly, I'm not sure I can present a comprehensive list, but I can certainly send you, we can put together a representative list of the kinds of discussions we've had with the government, the kinds of support and discussions we've had with civil society. I routinely, when I'm in Egypt, meet with civil society groups. It's most of what I do, meet with the government as well, but we also meet with groups here. So I'd be glad to provide some representative or illustrative examples of what we're doing. We take these issues extremely seriously. This is an extremely important area to Secretary Clinton, to me personally, and we're very aware of the precarious state of the Coptic community. These attacks are very serious, and we want to do whatever we can to to make sure that this kind of violence doesn't continue and this kind of discrimination.
Thank you. What actions has the State Department taken since the October 9 incident, when the military directly attacked and killed Egyptian citizens, to press the Egyptian government for a transparent investigation and to press the Egyptian government to prosecute those who were actually responsible for the murders of citizens?
As I mentioned briefly in my oral comments, I think there's a bit more detail in the statement I submitted. Both the President and Secretary Clinton have issued public statements about the attack. Ambassador Patterson has been engaged almost on a daily basis since October 9th in urging and reiterating the importance of there being a strong investigation and prosecution of those who are involved. We are very mindful of the potential for there to be an escalation of violence. This was a tragic incident where people were killed, many more injured, and so we have been very, very mindful of it. I've talked several times to Ambassador Patterson about it, and she is completely aware of all the details. There have been discussions with the military, discussions with security forces, Ministry of Interior, and the like. We will continue to press, as I said in the testimony, there are 2 investigations underway. Investigation doesn't equal results. And so our focus now is making sure that the people who are involved in these violent acts are brought to justice, that they are prosecutions and convictions, and that the government is clear in its public statement and its action that this kind of violence cannot be countenanced.
We all know that if there are no prosecutions of these violent acts against the minority groups, the Coptic Christians, then violence is going to continue. Do you know of any successful prosecutions against violent acts against Coptic Christians?
Yeah, and again, I would come back first of all to the tragic attacks in Nag Hammadi in January of 2010. I was in Egypt literally 2 weeks after those people were gunned down. I met with the ministry, the head of state security. I met with people in the government to make just the point you're making. There has to be a serious investigation that leads to prosecutions. One of the principal perpetrators was prosecuted and convicted. 2 were acquitted. And as I mentioned in my testimony yesterday, the government, the court reopened the case against those 2, and they will be put on trial before a military court on December 19th. So that's one example. There's several others. But we're not satisfied that enough has been done, and certainly in the case of the October 9th violence, it's critical that there be a full investigation and prosecution.
Thank you. What role should the United States play in promoting human rights and religious freedom specifically? The chairman asked about how much economic assistance was directed towards promoting human rights. What kind of things should we be doing specifically to promote these principles?
Well, I think in a broad sense, all of the building blocks of democracy are in formation, and we ought to do what we can to reinforce that development. There is a lively civil society in Egypt, but many of the organizations are not yet able to register. We've raised concerns about that. We need to be supportive of an independent media. We need to support bloggers and activists who continue to raise concerns that are among the issues we're discussing today. So there are a range of things that I think we've begun to do, and we need to stay the course. We need to make sure that there is a move away from a government that relies on an emergency law, move more towards a civilian rule of law, and we need to support a political process that allows multiple views by nonviolent parties that respect religious freedom, freedom of speech, association, the rights of women.
Now, you mentioned earlier the importance of diversity. How could the authorities involve Islamic and Christian religious establishments in a strategy to strengthen this idea of diversity, of values of religious tolerance and coexistence?
You know, this is a process of, I think we start from a premise, I start from a premise that for several decades, institutions of government and non-governmental institutions were ossified. They weren't allowed to flourish and operate openly. And so when I say we're in a beginning of a transition, we're at a place where we can encourage, but Egyptian people have to lead in creating a more open discussion, both about advancing a pluralistic democratic political process, but as part of that, encouraging diversity of views, diversity of religions, diversity of perspectives to be part of that mix. We take these things for granted in a society where we've had a lot of experience dealing with it. We're in Egypt in a very early stage of a transitional process where all of these elements are still being set up, as it were.
What about training, for instance, for judges, for prosecutors, for police, teachers, whomever, those who are responsible for administering and applying the law about respecting these rights?
I think those are critical elements, and those are very much
engaged in encouraging that.
Absolutely. I mean, there are discussions going on now between our governments about how can we best support a transformation, transition in the police. There's a long history of the police playing state security playing roles that we would consider antithetical to the way in which we practice democracy. And so it's important that there be a move towards professionalizing the police, professionalizing the courts, creating, as I say, strong civilian institutions that are the kind of foundation, the basis for a democracy. All of that's on the table. We're doing training already of some of the political parties, voter education, all of that. But democracy isn't just elections. It's also building those strong institutions, police, prosecutors, courts, the media. All of those institutions are part of what makes sustainable democracy real. And we're very much engaged in the discussion of all those things. Again, I want to say again, though, we need to take our lead from people of Egypt. This is their moment of transition, and it's critical that Egyptians lead. We are more than willing, we're eager to be a strong partner in those efforts, but we've got to come in a way that reinforces what Egyptians themselves are demanding and pursuing.
Thank you. Now, I was a little surprised with your answer to the chairman about this barbaric practice of forced kidnapping and forced conversion, if you will, forced marriages and conversion of Coptic Christians. For 15 years, I've talked to people in Egypt who said this is a common practice. Doesn't the State Department, aren't they aware of this? Aren't they pursuing this issue?
As I said, Congressman, we are very aware of the discriminatory practices that make it very difficult, for example, for people to convert from Islam to Christianity. We are aware of the discrimination and some of the harassment of the Christian community. That's what this hearing is about. On the subject of abductions
and marriage, forced marriage.
And forced marriage, the broad allegations are out there. What we need and what we're looking for are specific cases that we can pursue. If we get those cases, we will pursue them ourselves and raise them with the government. We know those allegations are out there, but as of this moment, They're not specific cases where we've been able to substantiate what's been alleged in a broad sense. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. What I'm saying is the more information we get, I am very open, in fact, eager to get information about specific cases that we can then examine ourselves and take to the government of Egypt.
Would my friend yield briefly?
Yes.
My concern is that we're not even looking, and not looking. I mean, this isn't something that's going to walk up and say, here's a forced marriage, because of retaliation, because of the killing of the young woman, the fact that in many cases she feels she cannot go back to her Coptic family, and all the other reasons. This is something that very aggressively, if not and covertly probably, has to be looked at, which is why human rights investigators, I mean, I would hope there would be no takeaway for the Egyptian government that somehow our government is saying it has not been substantiated. I believe that the evidence is compelling. It awaits further investigation, but we need to be, I think, as aggressive as all get out. I mean, you know, any daughter, any young woman to be abducted and forced into what I really believe is sexual slavery, and to lose your faith and your life, and to be forcibly married through some level of and degree of coercion, is among the worst human rights abuses I can possibly think of. So I would hope the takeaway would be to deploy our Foreign Service or human rights officers and to do a major study on this, to initiate something that leaves no stone unturned, and we need to bring this up in every possible forum with the SCAF and every other official in Egypt.
Congressman, I share the concern. I will make sure, I will redouble our efforts with our embassy to make sure they're pursuing this subject in the way that you suggest. It would also help us if there are particular cases that come to your attention that makes it easier for us to pursue this in a more concrete way.
Yeah, I thank you for that. I know that is the desire, but you have to also keep in mind you don't want to jeopardize the lives, the safety of the families, the women, you know, who are involved in this horrific practice. But thank you very much. We appreciate your willingness to look into that.
Commissioner Pitts, thank you very much. And I'd just like to ask one final question,
sure.
Mr. Secretary. And in a way, we've talked about it, but just to get your reaction to this statement by Dr. Michelle Dunn from the Rafik Hariri Center for the Middle East of the Atlantic Council. In her testimony, she'll say, the SCAF's approach has been almost identical to that of the Mubarak era. That is, after each sectarian incident, the authorities promised to investigate and prosecute crimes vigorously and to address the underlying causes of the incident, such as discriminatory laws regarding the building and the alteration of places of worship. But as soon as public attention moves on, such efforts are either abandoned or long delayed, leaving the victims with a sense of injustice and the perpetrators with a sense of impunity, and sowing the seeds of further violence. In cases where military government or government officials are accused of complicity in violence or at least irresponsibility in dealing with it, the SCAF has staunchly resisted accountability. Is that a true statement or a false statement?
Well, I think I would answer that by saying we are now at a critical moment following the October 9th violence. And what I've said here and what I think this hearing has helped us amplify is the need, one, for accountability. There are two investigations going on. It's important that you and we stay the course in monitoring the progress of those investigations. And the other piece is the government's stronger commitment to adopt a unified law on construction of new religious sites, repairs, etc., and to amend the penal code in a way that fights discrimination in a more particular way. I want to leave this hearing with a sense that these are priorities for the United States. I think it's great that you've had this hearing. It helps draw attention to these issues, and there should be no doubt in anybody's mind that we are highly attentive to the need for accountability and for affirmative expressions by the government of their desire to end a process of practices of discrimination.
We're joined by Gus Bilirakis from Florida. Mr. Villarocks, do you have any statement or comments you'd like to make?
I do have a statement, if that's all right?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm on the European Subcommittee.
You got to put your mic on, Mike.
Thank you. But anyway, I'm sorry that I'm late. I commend, of course, Chairman Smith and Chairman McGovern for holding this very important hearing. I've been heartsick over recent tragic events that have taken place in Egypt against the Coptic Christians. It is devastating what is happening to them under the current military regime in Egypt. The United States should contemplate defunding the Egyptian military until they can guarantee the religious freedom of all minority faiths, specifically the Coptic Christians. Christians are dying or being displaced as we speak. Perpetuating religious freedom for all minority religions, and especially Christians in the Middle East, will continue to be a top priority of mine. I look forward to meeting with your brothers and sisters here in faith later this week, and I have some constituents coming up, Mr. Speaker, as well. But we need to do everything we can on behalf of religious freedom throughout the world, but particularly in the Middle East. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. Okay, now the next panel is. Okay, I'd like to introduce the second panel. Welcome. First, we have Dina Gurgis. I hope I pronounced that correctly. She's an Egyptian-American democracy activist and attorney and member of the Egyptian American Rule of Law Association. Formerly, she was the Keston Family Research Fellow and the Washington Institute for Near East Policies Project, FICRA. She founded and was editor of a near real-time Arabic-English blog called FICRA Forum, connecting Arab activists with U.S. policymakers on issues of regional political reform. Prior to joining the Institute, Ms. Gurgis was the executive director of Voices for a Democratic Egypt. She holds a J.D. from Vanderbilt University Law School. Welcome. Next, we have Samuel Tadros. Samuel is a research fellow with the Center for Religious Freedom and the Hudson Institute. Before joining Hudson in 2011, Mr. Tadros was a senior partner at the Egyptian Union of Liberal Youth and an organization that aims to spread the ideas of classical liberalism in Egypt. He previously interned at the American Enterprise Institute and worked as a consultant for both the Hudson Institute on moderate Islamic thinkers and the Heritage Foundation on religious freedom in Egypt. He holds a master's degree from Georgetown University. Next, we have Michelle Dunn. She's the director of the Atlantic Council, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, but Rafik Hariri Center for the Middle East. Dr. Dunn has served in the White House on the National Security Council staff, on the State Department's policy planning staff, and its Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and is a diplomat in Cairo and Jerusalem. Prior to joining the Atlantic Council, she was a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where she edited the Arab Reform Bulletin and carried out research on Arab politics and U.S. policies. She holds a doctorate in Arabic language and linguistics from Georgetown University. Welcome. And now we'll begin the testimony. Ms. Gurgis, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Can you hear me now? Great. Good afternoon, and thank you to Chairman Smith for organizing this timely hearing. Thank you, Congressman Bilirakis. I'm especially pleased to have the opportunity to give testimony on Egypt's not only continuing but growing sectarian problem. I would even characterize it as a crisis at this point. To begin with, if I die, take me to Tahrir. These were the last words uttered by Mina Daniel, a young man in Mespiro who eventually succumbed to a sniper bullet that entered his chest and exited through his lower back on October 9th, which has come to be known as Bloody Sunday. Mina's story is only the most recent example of the plight of Egypt's Christians and tragic manifestation of Egypt's sectarian crisis, a matter on which I testified earlier this year in January. At that time, I began my testimony by quoting 22-year-old Mariam Fikri, who had posted a New Year's prayer for 2011 on her Facebook page just hours before she was killed in a heinous attack on the Two Saints Church in Alexandria on New Year's Eve, which left at least 21 people dead. Then, I stated that Miriam's hopes and ultimate fate, and now, joining her, Mina Daniel's, even after Egypt's promising revolution, so tragically and poignantly illustrate the plight of the Coptic people, Egypt's native Christians, who represent 10 to 15% of Egypt's 83 million people. I stated that while the Copts are the Middle East's largest Christian minority, they have faced an alarming escalation of violence as state protection has dwindled. I explained that for at least 3 decades, we, the Copts, have been offered an authoritarian compact of sorts. The Copts, as all Egyptians, were to live under a draconian emergency law suspending basic constitutional protections in exchange for the delivery of stability and protection from terrorism. In those 3 decades, however, Egypt failed to make adequate progress on key developmental indicators, and Egypt's human rights record fared no better. Egypt's record on religious freedom went from bad to worse, placing it on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom's watch list since 2002. After Egypt's revolution, the Commission recommended for the first time the further downgrade of Egypt's status, designating Egypt as a, quote, country of particular concern, or CPC, for, quote, engaging in and tolerating egregious violations of freedom of religion or belief. While religious freedom conditions in Egypt have been deteriorating during the last years of the Mubarak regime, the Commission stated, since Mubarak's ouster on February 11th, conditions have further deteriorated, end quote. In the Commission's view, this deterioration has warranted Egypt's ranking alongside China, Iran, and Afghanistan. I last testified on Egypt's sectarian problem on January 20th, only 5 days before the Egyptian revolution broke out. Back then, I described the authoritarian pact offered by the Mubarak regime as an illusory, Faustian bargain. I argued the real answer to Egypt's sectarian crisis is progress toward a democratic state that respects human rights, applies the rule of law, and extends equal protection to all citizens. I also noted that the Egyptian regime will avoid doing so at all costs. But we soon learned that Egyptians' frustration with decades of tyranny could not be indefinitely contained. And on January 25th, Egyptians of all stripes took to the street to demonstrate precisely that. Somewhat cautiously, Christians regarded the revolution as a potential turning point and joined their fellow Muslim citizens in demanding fundamental change which they hoped would entail a new Egypt based on principles of equal citizenship, rule of law, and individual freedoms. Instead, Egypt's current trajectory highlights not just substantial challenges to democratic transition, but the absence of political will from the current military regime to effect that transformation. In the process, Egypt's vulnerable groups, including the Copts, women, and others, are more susceptible than ever to unprecedented violence and insecurity. In 2011 alone, Copts have been the target of 33 sectarian attacks, 12 of which involved an attack on a church. The combined casualties, even before the latest Maspero massacre, include 72 dead, as well as a substantial number of Christian homes, property, and churches destroyed. With the Maspero massacre, the death toll rises to 97, and the number of those injured exceeds 400. Compared to 2010, these statistics represent more than a six-fold increase in Christian casualties in 2011. While some may blame the revolution for this serious escalation and praise the relative stability of the Mubarak days, I submit that the same societal ills, and more significantly, the insidious state role in inciting sectarian violence, plague Egypt more than ever today. And that responsibility lies in no small measure squarely at the foot of the military dictatorship, represented by the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, or SCAF, which has adopted the old authoritarian tactics while proclaiming itself, quote, the revolutionary government. For decades, the regime encouraged and capitalized on the growth of a culture of discrimination against religious minorities, and eventually sectarian crimes became crimes of impunity. We've already heard about that from Assistant Secretary Posner. Substituting the extension of the rule of law and equal protection, the state always insisted on, quote, reconciliation sessions, where victims and perpetrators were coerced into extrajudicial settlements by the state security apparatus. In March of 2011, after Mubarak's ouster, when a Christian man had his ear severed by hardline Islamists known as Salafis in Upper Egypt, SCAF very powerfully conveyed the message of impunity by forcing the victim, that man, not to bring legal charges and failing to investigate or bring the perpetrators to justice. Perceiving the continuation of the status quo, this and similar incidents strengthen extremist convictions that not only would the state tolerate blatant persecution of Christians and minorities, but it would do so with a nod and wink for its own interests, much like the days of the Mubarak era. Capitalizing on an environment of police absence from Egyptian streets following the Egyptian revolution, a massive security failure on the interim government's part, which itself requires investigation and accountability, the Salafis, hardline Islamists, once again lashed out at Christians in May, when they accused the Coptic Church of holding alleged Christian converts to Islam against their will. Incitement by the Salafis in a poor, crowded neighborhood of Cairo resulted in an all-out war between Muslims and Christians, which lasted for hours with absolutely no police or military intervention, leaving 12 dead and 2 churches burnt to the ground at the end of the day. The response of SCAF to the incident was to send in a Salafi preacher known as Muhammad Hassan to the neighborhood to pacify the situation. This preacher has long been known for his incitement against Christians and calls for their second-class citizenship. He's also the same man that was granted a podium and allowed by the military regime to preach from Tahrir Square in the weeks following Mubarak's ouster, where he was given free rein to express hate speech. I refer you specifically to this example because I think Chairman Smith had asked Assistant Secretary Posner whether the government was in any way involved in provoking sectarian incidents, and these are some very minor examples, and examples abound. While the churches were rebuilt, no one was held to account for the day's heinous violence, and when interviewed about this in the independent media, SCAF General Hassan al-Ruwaini stated that it was, quote, preposterous to demand further action on the matter, including an investigation and arrests, since the churches were, after all, rebuilt. Once again, taking their cue from SCAF's Mubarakist treatment of Egypt's vicious sectarianism, extremist Muslim youths in an upper Egyptian town called Edfu took it upon themselves in September to destroy a church because it allegedly lacked the necessary permits, even though the church was an ancient one and had been in operation for years. Rather than hold the youths to account, the region's governor instead praised them. SCAF subsequently refused an independent commission's recommendation that the governor be removed. With these successive tragedies in mind and years of societal intolerance, institutionalized discrimination, and state complicity and incitement continuing with the SCAF's blessing, Christians took peacefully to the streets on October 9th, as they had alongside other Egyptians during the 18-day uprising, to protest the military regime's denial of basic civil liberties. Muslim activists and sympathizers joined them in their call. They were, as we all know now, met with disproportional violence, culminating in live shootings and the crushing of unarmed civilians by armored personnel carriers, or APCs. Meanwhile, while the corpses of civilians, most of whom were Christian, were being taken to hospitals, Egyptian state television misrepresented the facts, stating that, quote, Coptic gangs had killed 3 soldiers and were attacking the military in a manner, quote, not even the Israelis would dare. End quote, even going so far as to exhort, quote, honorable Egyptians to come to the defense of their military against these elements. This incitement directly led to vigilante acts of sectarian violence in Cairo streets, where some Muslims sought out and targeted Christians for retribution and beatings or worse. Unsurprisingly, but no less tragically, the SCAF's ensuing press conference addressing the tragedy blamed the victims and exhorted Egyptians to, quote, put themselves in the place of the soldier driving the armored carrier, who was understandably confused and panicked. Adding insult to injury, the SCAF praised the role of Egyptian state TV, and when asked about the names of the alleged military casualties, refused to release them for, quote, security reasons. Again, when we're talking about provocation of the state, this is a very, very blatant example. Egyptian state TV does not act independently of the government. Thus, in the aftermath of the revolution, the state itself has continued institutionalized discrimination and encouraged the growth of a culture of sectarianism and impunity to act on that sectarianism. During the last days of the Mubarak era, a Cairo-based human rights organization had described Egypt as a, quote, police state infused increasingly with theocratic elements. I would submit that if you substitute the words police state with military state, this would be an accurate description of the state of things today. The military regime continues to count on divide and conquer tactics to consolidate its power. It continues to scapegoat the Copts to deflect from its own governance failures. It continues to sow instability and simultaneously present itself as the sole solution to that instability, justifying along the way the continuation or institution of new repressive practices and laws. One need only give a cursory look at SCAF's history since its assumption of power. As the chairman quoted, over 12,000 civilians have been tried in military tribunals that do not meet minimal standards of due process. Female protesters have been subjected to degrading virginity tests. The notorious emergency law, which Egyptians were ruled by for 3 decades and were looking forward to its removal as soon as Mubarak left, was extended, and numerous laws restricting freedom of assembly and even criminalizing criticism of the military have been opaquely passed and enforced in draconian fashion. Local rights groups are already decrying these abuses and more, including the SCAF's pre-election conduct, which observers accurately note portends substantial fraud in upcoming elections, where Islamists are expected to win a substantial parliamentary presence. This parliament, according to the SCAF's transition plan, will be responsible for the drafting of Egypt's new constitution, raising doubts about whether such a document will embody the aspirations of Egyptians as expressed through their revolution, which rejected notions of both autocracy and theocracy, but rather expressed a desire for a civil, meaning non-military and non-religious state. Attempts by the SCAF to issue, quote, guiding principles for the constitution are little comfort. While the US government may be banking on SCAF to turn Egypt into a pre-Erdogan Turkish model, what is actually unfolding is more analogous to models such as the Pakistani one, entailing greater collusion between military authorities and Islamists at the expense of all other political forces. This is clearly a dangerous situation. Avoiding this outcome requires that the US not fall into the trap it previously did with Mubarak, placing as it did all its bets on the authoritarian partner and a police state, which is what we have today. This means that the US must insist that its support during and for Egypt's transition be contingent on a prompt and genuine democratic transition to a civilian authority, which represents the aspirations of all Egyptians and guarantees the equal rights of all, starting with the immediate cessation of sectarian incitement and elimination of all forms of discrimination, and including, but not limited to, the immediate security sector reform entailing the prompt return of police to the streets, the conduct of free and fair and monitored elections, an inclusive and transparent constitutional drafting process, the elimination of laws that repress basic rights, and the expansion of the political space to allow a greater role for civil society and non-religious political parties, and ultimately a free civilian presidential race which represents a true handoff of power from the military. Egypt's civilian president must then go about undoing decades of the disease of pernicious sectarianism which has infiltrated society through undertaking substantial legal, institutional, educational, and media reform, all vast tasks which only a person entrusted and vested with the faith of Egyptians and the interests of Egypt, and not the interests of a few privileged generals, could assume. We owe it to those who sacrificed to herald a new era of freedom in the Middle East. We owe it to a young Mina Daniel, who, while anticipated being killed by Mubarak's police forces while camped out in Tahrir Square during Egypt's courageous 18-day uprising, survived then, only to be massacred a few months later at the hands of Mubarak's successors, who represent more of the same. Thank you.
Ms. Girgis, thank you very much for your very powerful testimony and for previous testimonies you provided to this commission. I'd like to yield to Mr. Adderholt, distinguished member of this commission, for any comments he might have.
Thank you. I came in late, and so and to the panel, I apologize for my tardiness. But the SCAF is what is certainly disconcerting about a lot of the reports that we've heard. But I guess my question would be just, in your opinion, do you think that they have deliberately provoked confrontation with Coptic Christians, basically going back to that date of October 9th?
This question is directed at me, I assume. Okay. Just the specific events in terms of who started shooting when and where are still being parsed out, and I suspect that that will remain unclear for some time, given that the military has undertaken to investigate itself. Whereas it is the accused party in all of this, which truly undermines the independence of any such investigation. What is clear, however, is one thing, which is the incitement of the state or official TV on that day. I, as most Egyptians living abroad, was glued to Egyptian TV on that day and following the independent media as well. And the vast difference in reporting was quite stunning. As I stated before, official Egyptian TV can never act independently, would certainly never release numbers of military casualties and actually name an aggressor party without direct orders from the SCAF. In fact, after the incident, when there was a lot of criticism regarding the conduct of the official media in covering the massacre, a group of anchors that were working for official TV resigned in protest. And they explicitly in their statement stated that they had received explicit orders from the SCAF in terms of what to report and how to report that incident. And as I mentioned, the reporting led to direct violence. And as a lawyer, I can tell you that this rises to the level of criminal incitement, which should be punishable by law. So clearly in that instance, the instance of the incitement of the official media, the SCAF can be the only responsible party.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I may have some more questions after the rest of the testimony. Thank you.
Mr. Adderholt, thank you so very much. I'd like to now recognize, for purpose of receiving his testimony, Samuel Tedros, Research Fellow, Hudson Institute Center for Religious Freedom. Please proceed as you would like.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this timely and important hearing and for inviting me to testify today on the plight of Egypt's Christians and what it signifies for the prospects of a democratic transition in Egypt. The title of today's hearing suggests a correlation and a linkage between religious freedom, or more precisely the lack thereof, and democracy and the prospects of a democratic Egypt. Unfortunately, for many policymakers, this linkage has been absent. The modern debasement of the concept of a free society to essentially mean the holding of elections has led to people ignoring the religious freedom as a foundation for a truly free society. The recent massacre of Copts, while significant in terms of the number of people that were killed, has to be viewed as part of an ongoing pattern that has taken its effect for many years. That pattern is a continuation of events and attacks that had been conducted before, during the Mubarak regime and before that, and continue after the revolution. The three main parties that influence and take part in this pattern of discrimination are the Islamists, the Egyptian government, and the general population. Instead of naming the specific incidents that my colleague has mentioned, I think it's important to look at how those three elements work together to create this culture of intolerance and attacks on Christians. The first party in that regard, the Islamists, have been conducted numerous attacks on Christians. We've seen a number of those attacks, most recently before the revolution, the Alexandria church bombing on New Year's Eve. The state, for its part, has a number of very discriminatory laws against Christians, limiting the number of Christians in government service and putting restrictions on the building of churches. On the other hand, the government also participates in encouraging this culture through its impunity that it provides to the people conducting the attacks. The undersecretary mentioned the latest incident where someone was for the first time punished for one of those incidents in the Naga Hammadi attack. Unfortunately, this is the first time that such action is taken. We've seen a long list of attacks where no one has ever been punished for them, creating the impression that attacking Christians was unpunishable and thus encouraged. The third element, and the most problematic for the future of Christians in Egypt, is the general intolerance amongst their Muslim countrymen. This increase in number of attacks by ordinary Muslims, encouraged at certain moments by Islamists, whether the Salafis or others, or driven by their own feelings of or their opinions about Copts, this number of attacks has been very problematic. If we can think that the government can be stopped or restrained by certain actions on behalf that the US can take or pressure applied, if we can think that the Islamists can be contained somehow, it is the fact of being attacked by one's neighbors that is very problematic for the future of Christians in the Middle East. As Egyptians took to the streets in January and February, there were huge hope that this was about to change. Powerful images of Christians and Muslims praying together and protesting together in Tahrir Square led to this belief that democracy would bring with it religious freedom. Unfortunately, reality has started to hit very soon. We've seen a continuation and a substantial increase in the number of attacks and the continuation of those patterns that we had witnessed before the revolution. The Islamists, now emboldened by the complete lack of control with the absence of the state security, have now started to take more drastic attacks against the Copts, whether in terms of attacks on specific Coptic churches or attacks generally in their TV channels on Copts and inciting people to act against them. The government, for its part, has not taken any action to stop this and has not punished anyone for those attacks. Again, as was mentioned, while the government, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, has built the one church that was burnt in Atfih to the south of Cairo, they have not punished anyone for that specific attack. They have also not, until this moment, although the trial has been ongoing, offered any speedy trial for the people that have conducted the Imbaba attacks. As was mentioned also, they have continued to hold this pattern of reconciliation meetings whereby Christians and Muslims are expected to kiss each other, and that would be the end of the affair. Those reconciliation councils have encouraged, again, this feeling that the local Muslim population can then put its demands on its Christian neighbors. The last element is that ongoing sectarian increase or the intolerance increase among the general Muslim population. We've seen a number of incidents where Christian girls are required to wear the hijab by government-appointed headmasters in schools. It was mentioned by a distinguished member before during the opening remarks, the very disturbing incident of Ayman Nabil Labib, a 17-year-old student in the school in Egypt, and being killed by his very own colleagues and students in his classroom. This increased level of attacks by the ordinary Muslim population is the most alarming for the future. Again, governments can be restrained and pressured, Islamists can be contained. This level of intolerance is the most drastic element in the whole process. We also see a continuation in terms of the government arresting a number of Christians and holding them as a bargaining chip with the church leadership, where the Pope and the various bishops are pressured to agree to the government's lack of action in exchange for getting their members out of the Egyptian jails. This pattern of arresting a number of Christians, we've seen it again with the Maspero incident, with around 25 Christians arrested and that remain in jail as we speak today. This increased level has raised the question for Christians whether Egypt, that might be democratic in its future or might not, but whether Egypt will be a place for its Christian minority. Like their Jewish counterparts years ago, 60, 70 years ago, they are beginning to realize that their countries might be a place that is not welcoming for them anymore. Unfortunately, unlike the Jews who had a place to go to, these people do not. The facts of demography and geography pose limitation on any attempt to provide safe havens or any other such notions. The remaining prospect of immigration is problematic in it of itself. While we've seen waves of immigration before of Iraqi Christians and perhaps in the future Syrian ones, the numbers that are involved in Egypt are much larger. Simply put, neither the West nor anywhere in the region is there a place for 8 to 10 million refugees. This again creates the problem that while the richest elements of the Coptic community might be willing and capable of leaving the country, the poorest ones, the ones that face the daily discrimination in their lives, will not find a place to go and will be living under this, what is becoming a very, very cold and long winter. For those that are concerned with Egypt's future, it is also becoming very clear that elections will not provide a solution to religious freedom. I do not have a crystal ball, but I am willing to predict that the Muslim Brotherhood will win a majority in the next Egyptian elections. This will change a culture of impunity into a culture of encouragement. Whether by the Muslim Brotherhood or the more extremist Salafi groups, the prospects for the Christians in Egypt are becoming darker. Egypt remains a key ally and friend of the United States, and cooperation between the two countries take place on various issues, most importantly, the military. However, the prospect of a democratic Egypt and one that is based on religious freedom is important to the U.S. national security and will have its effects on that cooperation on the long term. I have a number of policy recommendations or comments in that regard that I perhaps believe might be better left to the question, or should I? Sure. The first element that we should understand is punishment for those that have conducted those attacks. There has been a good development in that regard last week with the military judges announcing for the first time that there are military personnel that have been arrested and will be tried for the Maspero attack. This is the first time that the military actually acknowledges, even unofficially, that they did something wrong during that attack. An encouragement for that process to continue and for punishment to be provided for those responsible is something that the U.S. should work on. Secondly, we understand now that the Muslim Brotherhood will take a majority in the next parliament and that Christians will continue to be underrepresented. We must make sure that underrepresentation in terms of electoral votes does not result in underrepresentation in terms of the writing of the constitution. Making sure that the next Egyptian constitution will be one that protects religious freedom and provides equal citizenship for all of Egypt's people is something that we need to definitely work on. Thirdly, while it's the long electoral timetable that the SCAF has suggested provides us with an understanding that they will remain involved in running, ruling and governing the country. With also the collapse of the police force, it is likely that the army will continue to provide basic law and order services in Egypt for some time in the future. The U.S. military has built a tremendous cooperation with the Egyptian military, and the U.S. military provides trainings for the Egyptian army on a variety of issues, including trainings on basic law and order, which the U.S. has perfected in conflict zones, in various conflict zones, should be something that the U.S. can help the army deal with those situations better. Fourthly, while the U.S. Department of State and USAID and MEPI have provided a variety of funding to strengthen democracy in Egypt, there have been very disturbing reports of a lot of this money, or at least some, going to Islamist parties whose commitment to religious freedom is, to say the least, questionable. Making sure that religious freedom is one of the key elements whereby those seeking help, those groups and parties seeking help, are recognized and judged upon is an important step. Lastly, this money that is being provided for strengthening various groups looking for having a sound or a voice in their country's future. As a minority, the Copts are facing numerous challenges in organizing themselves. Whether any of that money provided by state goes specifically to minority groups to help them, like other Egyptians, to organize themselves and bring their voices to building their country's future is something that needs to be looked into. Again, thank you very much for organizing this session and inviting me to testify. Thank you.
Mr. Tedros, thank you very much for your testimony, for your incisive analysis of the current near-term and long-term situation, and your policy recommendations, which will be most helpful going forward. Dr. Dunn, if you would proceed.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished members, thank you for the honor of testifying before the Commission. As you noted in your opening statement, Mr. Chairman, it is quite disappointing that the unity between Muslims and Christians that we saw in Tahrir Square just earlier this year has deteriorated, and sectarian tensions have escalated dangerously in the intervening months. But the violence is not, unfortunately, I think, particularly surprising, because it's expected in a post-revolutionary climate that the tensions and conflicts that were beneath the surface are going to emerge more openly. And the sectarian tensions have been present for decades, but it was noticeable for the last couple of years that they were rising, and especially in the months leading up to the January Revolution. The attack on the church in Alexandria at the beginning of January has been mentioned a number of times, and even leading up to that, there were a number of anti-Christian riots, particularly by Salafi Muslim groups that have become much more active in Egypt in the last couple of years. And I would suggest that the increasing activity of these Salafi groups is one of the reasons why we have seen these kind of tensions and anti-Christian violence on the rise. Now, these clear and disturbing trends that were apparent even before the revolution make it all the more difficult to understand why the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, the SCAF, that was entrusted by Egyptians with the authority upon the forced resignation of former President Mubarak, has failed to address sectarian violence in any effective manner. The SCAF's approach has been almost identical to that of the Mubarak era. That is, after each sectarian incident, the authorities promised to investigate and prosecute crimes vigorously and to address the underlying causes of the incident, such as discriminatory laws. But as soon as public attention moves on, such efforts are either abandoned or long delayed, leaving the victims with a sense of injustice and the perpetrators with a sense of impunity, and sowing the seeds of further violence. As has already been noted during this hearing, the investigations of several serious incidents of large-scale anti-Christian violence leading to the deaths of almost 100 people and the injuries of hundreds more are ongoing, and they might well be inconclusive if we look at what has happened in previous instances, going back even to the El Kosh massacre a decade ago. What typically happens in these events is that the investigations are botched, either deliberately or through negligence, and that there's very little, if any, effective prosecution after the fact. And in the case where military or government officials are accused of complicity or at least irresponsibility, and also today we've discussed this October 9th incident in Maspero extensively, the SCAF has staunchly resisted accountability. I would note that the SCAF's seeming inability to carry out these investigations and prosecutions in an expeditious fashion contrasts very much with their speed in prosecuting bloggers and others who are critical of the military. Also, I will skip through this, but the transitional authority supervised by the SCAF also has been very slow to make the promised legal changes, especially these laws regarding the building and renovation of places of worship, which over and over again, for years and decades now, have been at the root of some of these sectarian tensions. Now, anti-Christian violence is one of several serious Egyptian issues that the SCAF has shown itself to be unwilling or unable to deal with. Others include rising crime, lack of needed police reforms, and a deteriorating economy. As a military organization, the SCAF is not equipped to address such issues, and it shouldn't be called upon to do so, particularly for a prolonged period. That's why it's essential that the SCAF agree to a clear, realistic timetable to turn over not only legislative, but also executive authority to elected civilians. The problem right now is that the SCAF is trying to postpone the transfer of executive authority until it secures guarantees of its status post-elections. And the status the military is seeking is not simply a continuation of the extensive political influence and economic perquisites it enjoyed during the Mubarak era, but actually more than that. The SCAF has sponsored a document of super-constitutional principles that would give it the implicit right to intervene in politics and the explicit right to overrule legislation, as well as freedom from civilian supervision or budgetary oversight. What this would produce, as Ms. Girgis noted, is a political system similar to that of Pakistan, where elected civilian institutions are relatively powerless, while unelected and unaccountable military and intelligence services actually run the country. And as we know from Pakistan, as well as from Egypt's own history and current situation, in that kind of a system, military and intelligence organizations often manipulate sectarian tensions and extremist tendencies within the country in order to serve narrow agendas. That would be a very unhappy outcome of the January 25th revolution for all Egyptians, including Egyptian Christians, and also, I would note, for the United States, because the United States cannot escape partial responsibility for the actions of the SCAF due to the tens of billions of dollars in U.S. military assistance that it has provided over the decade and continues to provide now. The United States should stand unambiguously on the side of the development of a real democratic system in which the rights of all citizens, including the right to religious freedom, will be protected in a climate of free political competition and the rule of law. Only in a democratic system will difficult issues such as anti-Christian violence and discrimination be able to be addressed openly. This will not happen overnight. Building a strong Egyptian democracy will be the project of many years. But it would be making a serious mistake to now create large new obstacles to a process of real democratization by acquiescing to the expansion and formalization of military control out of a fear that Islamists might gain a plurality or even a majority in the parliament to be elected over the next few months. There are many uncertainties involved when freely elected civilian institutions have real power. But one thing we know for certain is that military rulers will fail to protect all citizens and enforce laws without discrimination. Thank you very much.
Dr. Dunn, thank you as well for your excellent testimony. Let me just begin the questioning. Mr. Tedros, you mentioned in your testimony that faced with growing threats, it's no surprise the cops are questioning whether or not there's a future. And you said, isolated and ignored by the West, the cops can only wonder today whether after 2,000 years, the time has come for them to pack their belongings. If you could and the other panelists speak to the issue of isolated and ignored by the West. Does that include the United States? Has there been a dereliction on our part, our duty to promote democracy and freedom there? Does that include the administration, the Obama administration, the U.S. House and Senate, and the EU and others who, at least in theory, support democracy? I do believe that our intentions are right, but very often our intentions are not matched with deeds and with a seriousness about what the threat actually is. And your point that a ruler can be bought off or constrained by international pressure, but with the mob there is no constraints. We saw mob rule in history time and time again played out, and recently in the former Yugoslavia, where neighbor against neighbor committed unspeakable atrocities because not just impunity, but a sense of hatred that was otherworldly took over. So I wonder if you might speak to that issue of isolated and ignored by the West. How well are we doing? Are we being serious?
By isolated and ignored, I was referring to more of a historical story. The first is that Copts were historically isolated from Western Christendom by theological differences and were very skeptical about missionaries and what the West would offer them. The second is their experience under the British occupation was not a very pleasant one. Unlike the French and the Levant that favored religious minorities, the British and Egypt tried to undermine the Copts and exclude them from government service. Lord Cromer, the famous ruler of Egypt, was no friend in Copts and had very harsh opinions about them. This pattern of lack of a friend in the West, as compared to the Maronite community in Lebanon, for example, has made the Copts very skeptical about any real offers of help or the willingness of any Western power to help them. As to the specific actions of the United States, as the statement of the president that he made after the Maspero attack, it's a very disturbing statement, to say the least. The attitude of equating both the victim and the victimizer and asking both sides to show restraint is, again, very troubling. One wonders how Copts should show restraint. Restraint from dying, perhaps? One fails to understand the logic behind such actions. The president in his Cairo speech mentioned the Copts and the importance of their plight, but we have not seen any action in that regard. Again, the very disturbing reports of Islamist groups and parties getting money, being aided by the U.S. State Department through its policy of not looking at parties' ideologies, but whether they are committed to nonviolence, is a very disturbing thing and undermines the position of the Copts in the country. So if I am to judge this administration in terms of its interest and actions, I would view it completely as a failure. Thank you.
Sure. I'd like to add to that. Just adding my voice, the statement indeed after the massacre from the White House was extremely disappointing. The very notion of equating victim with aggressor is an insult to unspeakable tragedy already. And I think that there's been a little too much of U.S. Concessions to the U.S., to the Egyptian security solution for the Coptic problem, which ruled the day during the Mubarak era and which continues. It is sort of this blackmailing relationship where as long as you stay out of our sensitive files, including our treatment of religious minorities, you will continue to gain our cooperation on strategic interests. And I think that that argument has held way too much sway for way too long. Egypt has its own interests in cooperating with the United States, and there are compelling reasons, and there is no reason to think that Egypt will run to China tomorrow and turn away from the United States. One other comment that I have to make, a major disappointment. SCAF delegations have been coming on a routine basis since February to visit Washington. They make their rounds in the Pentagon, on the Hill, at the White House. Only days after the latest Maspero massacre, there was a new SCAF delegation that came in town, mostly actually to protest the attempts at conditioning foreign assistance that the House and the Senate were attempting to undertake. Well, who was assisting them in their lobbying efforts? was very disappointing for us to discover that CENTCOM was a part of that lobbying team. I myself have spoken to Pentagon officials in the aftermath of the Maspero massacre, and the statements that I heard were incredibly disappointing. I heard and was told directly that the military acted with restraint, that they were actually pleased that the outcome, was as it was, that it could have been much worse. And so certainly the military-to-military relationship, I think, is really skewing what the larger perspective on all of this should be and what this entails for U.S. longer-term strategic interests, not just in cooperating with Egypt, but in the region as a whole.
I agree that there's been a tendency on the side of the U.S. administration to accept the SCAF's narrative, which is that, we're just simple military men, we're doing our best, it's a difficult situation, and remember, it's us or the Islamists, that's your choice, and that, of course, is the right out of the old Mubarak playbook. I think, though, that the actions of the SCAF recently, this October 9th Maspero incident and their absolute failure to accept accountability for that, the super constitutional document that I mentioned, the harassment and persecution of non-governmental organizations, especially those receiving assistance from the United States, have really begun to make people here wake up a little bit to what the SCAF's real intentions might be. So I hope we will not continue to fall victim to this binary choice. It's either authoritarianism with all the ugliness that comes with that, or Islamism.
In questioning Michael Posner, the Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, I asked him a series of questions about Michelle Clark's testimony at our previous hearing. And he did indicate that he would take it back and hopefully robustly and very aggressively get the department to investigate forced marriages of Coptic Christian women and obviously the abductions that precede the forced marriage. Were you satisfied with his answers? Any of you want to comment on that?
On the specific issue, it's disturbing that those allegations have been there for a number of years. They've been reported without comments in the various State Department issued religious freedom reports. So it's a bit surprising that if those have been there, why didn't anyone investigate them before? The more disturbing element, perhaps, in the narrative that is accepted from SCAF is this issue of that the military and the Egyptian government will pass a new law governing the houses of worship. I'm not sure if people at State have read that law or not, but I have, and it in no way supports religious freedom. The law requires that an area of a minimum of 500 meters be available between any other religious building, a mosque. I don't know if anyone has visited Cairo, but I doubt there's any 500 meters between any two mosques in Cairo. So the idea that this law will somehow help Christians make it easier for them to build churches is debatable, to say the least.
Any other witnesses like to respond?
No, I do agree with that. I don't think it's a solution at all. I think the bottom line is that there continues to exist no political will to address the root causes of this problem. I think if the sectarian problem of Egypt, I think the solutions are there. Everybody knows them. We've been talking about them and offering them for years now. They've been on the books collecting dust in the Egyptian parliament for years now. But I think if you deprive any authoritarian government of that card, of the card to manipulate society in that way, to be able to use the divide and conquer card, to be able to sow instability and create these explosive events and justify their own existence, I think they would be gone. And that's the most powerful, in my view, one of the most powerful sort of evidentiary proofs there is of the intentions of the SCAF and what the SCAF actually represents.
Yes, Dr. Dunn.
I have not seen Ms. Clark's testimony, and I don't know anything about the specific cases that she raised there. I would say that having looked into some of these cases in the past, and I would say this is sometime in the past. This is, 10 years ago or so when I was at the U.S. Embassy in Cairo. What I found in some of these cases where I was able to find out what happened was that a member of one religious community had eloped with a member of another religious community. And this gets to the problem that religious conversion and intermarriage are completely unacceptable. And I believe they're unacceptable to both communities, to both the Muslim and Christian communities in Egypt. It is true that certainly Egyptian law discriminates in favor of Muslims in this case, that conversion to Islam is permitted and from Islam not so much. But I would say on the level of society, there is a deep issue here, and Dina was just alluding to it, that somehow cannot be addressed openly in a situation in which you have authoritarian governments that are manipulating these tensions for political advantage.
Is there anything else any of you would like to add before we conclude this hearing?
If I can add, going back to the Assistant Secretary's statement, where he writes on page 6, I want to make clear that most of these clashes have involved both Copts and Muslims, and members of both communities have been the perpetrators and victims of the violence. I'm not sure if State Department has seen any evidence of Copts attacking Muslims. At least I am not aware of any such incident. So it's a very interesting statement to put, to say the least.
Anything further? Thank you so much for your testimony. This will be part of an ongoing series of hearings. I plan in my subcommittee, it's called Africa Global Health, Global Human Rights, sometime in probably January or February to hold another hearing. And it's my understanding that the Lantos Commission for Human Rights might be planning one as well. While I don't chair it, Frank Wolf does. I am a member of that and certainly will be at it. And I think now more than ever, we need to bring maximum scrutiny, and I hope for some very wise interventions on the part of the U.S. government and our European Union friends and everyone else who is concerned about religious persecution as well as democracy and good governance, because there is a window of opportunity, it seems to me, and a window that is closing so fast, and things, as you pointed out, Mr. Tedos, that could get, it won't just be impunity, it'll encourage mob action, and in some cases they may already be there. So and for the record, when a delegation from Egypt came through and visited members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, I did join in meeting with them and had with me a catalog of human rights abuses directed against Coptic Christians, for which I got, that's been fixed and that's okay, we're working on that. Always some kind of, but that's always in the past, and I certainly was not convinced. And so I hope the wool is not being pulled over the eyes of members of Congress or the administration. With that, the hearing is adjourned.